Today we're talking about the relative strengths of the Space Marine units, which ones are best and which ones are worst. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where today we're doing a revamped tier list for Codex Space Marines units, talking through basically every choice in the Codex and how good I think they are relative to each other. I last did one of these tier lists around about a year ago now, and I thought it was high time for an update, seeing as since I did that, quite a few of the points costs have changed on the units, and since the initial experimentation period after Codex Space Marines dropped, people are perhaps a bit more settled as to which units are best and which units don't really see that much play. In the video, we're basically going to go through each and every Space Marine datasheet, starting with the weakest and going towards the strongest, and talking about each one in turn and where I've ranked them where I have. Just before we start, I'll just talk about a few things from the tier list in general. We're going to be basically sticking to the Codex Space Marines datasheets today. There's plenty of them to be going on with, though of course there's plenty of really strong options both in the Codex supplements and the Forge World Imperial Armor Compendium. I would bear in mind that tier lists do tend to be a bit arbitrary in nature, and in reality some things are likely to be fairly close between the tiers, and that for Space Marines more than any other faction, unit strength will really depend on the chapter that you pick. For example, chapters that have great assault chapter tactics and various stratagems and things will do much better with their various assault units, and plenty of other units have special synergies for certain codexes, such as Terminators and Bikes almost always being better in Dark Angels, or perhaps things like Melter and Flamers having so much more value to Salamanders. In this list I'll generally be talking about them as if they didn't have any sort of chapter tactics, just going by the relative strengths of the datasheets. And as always, let me know if you think that I've ranked anything too high or too low. I'm sure there's always room for me to learn and improve. In any case, let's jump into it, and we'll start with the lowest tier, Tier 4. So for Tier 4 Space Marine units, I've chosen to rank these three, which I think just are really struggling to compete in game right now. First up we have the Land Raider and its variants. They did get a small points decrease in the recent chapter approved book, but I'm just still not really sold on them being worth it at the moment, mainly due to their problematic combination of having lots of expensive guns and also wanting to roll their way towards the enemy in a place where they might quite likely get locked up. They're certainly a bit more attractive than they were before after a 20-point drop. I think that some lists can still make good use of them, but mainly because of that design flaw and being so vulnerable to being tagged in close combat by chaff infantry, I still think that they're rarely going to see any sort of competitive play. Next up, I've ranked the Gladiator Lancer. Again, this one received a points drop in chapter approved, and maybe it's not quite as far behind the other anti-tank options as it used to be. Still though, only 2 shots, even if they're good ones for 180 points, really is quite poor anti-tank. In terms of anti-tank firepower on the target, this thing is still behind the Predator Annihilator, which isn't exactly a paragon of efficiency in units in itself. I think this thing still needs further points cuts, or to have its main gun amped up, so it's absolutely devastating to tanks, as it's really not going to do that much to infantry. Finally, for the units I've ranked lowest, we have the Space Marine Hunter, the anti-air platform that fires a single very powerful missile. It's kind of okay against aircraft, though it still struggles to compete with the Stalker in that niche, but it's kind of absolutely abysmal against everything else, where you don't get the crazy damage output if it gets through. In general, if you're fighting aircraft, then it's not the worst pickup, but if you're playing a take or commons game where there might not be any aircraft present, you might be better off with virtually any other unit. Moving on though, we come to Tier 3, where I've chosen to rank a whole ton of the Space Marines' many and varied options. I think that all of these certainly can fill potential battlefield roles, though just perhaps maybe aren't all that points efficient and sometimes get passed over for other options. I think most of them remain usable though, if you're absolutely desperate to include 1 or 2 in a list. First up we have the Gladiator Reaper and Valiant, maybe some of the stronger picks here, and ones that potentially might have been tempted to put in Tier 2. Now they have dropped in points a bit. I think as Space Marine tanks go, these are arguably some of the best, relatively sturdy at toughness 8, a decent amount of firepower, either anti-infantry for the Reaper or anti-tank for the Valiant, and relatively fast as well. In general, I think they struggle to compete against units that have the core keyword, where you can get similar values of firepower and also have them multiplied by characters and things, but they seem quite a lot more efficient than many of the Space Marine tanks to me. Next we have a couple of characters. Company Ancients just seem a bit more underwhelming in 9th edition, now Space Marine armies aren't all building around shooting castles, and I'd usually be most tempted to take one if there was some sort of relic banner that I wanted to bring along, as opposed to the main Ancient shooting death rule. For Company Champions, they are a cheap and fighty Space Marine character, and if you invest a whole ton of relics and warlord traits on them, they can be very scary for the points indeed, but usually I'd be more tempted to take a captain or a lieutenant than this guy. Both of those can be very fighty if you invest the warlord traits and relics as well, and usually I think that the reroll aura and filling an HQ slot is usually worth the extra points. Even though some of the combos that you can put on them look quite fun, I've very rarely ever seen them taken in competitive Space Marine lists. Next up we have the Assault Centurions, some of the scarier models of 8th edition, getting a fairly hefty points bump, and also never gaining the core keyword. If you can get these guys up close, they are pretty efficient in terms of damage dealing. Flurries of Hurricane Bolter and Flamer shots will really mash light infantry, and those siege drills are just gloriously efficient melee against heavy targets. The main issue for me is delivering them. They really need to be able to deep strike and then have a boosted charge to try and get in melee, and I think that they have a lot more value in things like Raven Guard successors or maybe Deathwatch Teleportariums than they would anywhere else. I think most chapters are just going to struggle to deliver these into a position where they'll put their spectacular damage dealing to work. Next we have the Plasma Primaris in the Hellblaster squad. These guys again don't see all that much play competitively, though I don't think it would really take all that much to see them more competitively viable. Their shooting just doesn't really seem quite efficient enough to outweigh the downsides of blowing yourself up with overheats, though I have seen a few people running squads with the Assault Plasma Incinerators. Strength 6, high AP, and quite a lot of shots can be good against some of the armies right now. Perhaps things like Death Guard with their -1 damage, or Skitarii Infantry who ignore AP -2 and worse. In general though, I usually think that there are a fair few more efficient sources of Space Marine firepower. For the Devastator Centurions, again they haven't had such a great time of it in 9th. They can put out some fairly decent firepower, and can have a few interesting synergies, being a very large unit that's very points intensive. Any stratagems to amp up their damage or durability will be greatly appreciated. Again though, lacking the core keyword really doesn't do them any favours, and if you tool them up with a lot of guns, you're often paying almost as much per Centurion as you would for a tank, and while their firepower may be almost equivalent, their durability really isn't all that great. Maybe a unit that can have a bit more value in certain chapters where you can really make the most of their firepower, but if the enemy gets to damage them, then they're going to go down relatively easy for the big points investment. Next up we have Sternguard Veterans, who I'd say in their most basic form don't really tend to do all that much different to the Primaris troops choices, and as they're not troops, don't get OBSEC. Maybe the most interesting use of them will be to load them up in a drop pod with a whole load of combi weapons. Certainly could be a good way of delivering a whole ton of flamers or melters if you're salamanders, though people do seem to often prefer devastators for that role. Overall, like a lot of Space Marine choices, I don't really think they're all that bad, but they just tend to get outcompeted by other similar choices. I'd say very similarly of the Veteran Intercessors as well. They pay an extra couple of points for an extra attack on their model, but as they don't really have all that much flexibility to take some high damage or high AP weapons, people tend to leave them on the shelf for other choices. Generally, if you want troops to hold objectives, you're better off with the cheaper and more durable per point standard Intercessors, and if you want damage dealing elites, you're generally going to be better off with something with higher AP or multi-damage weapons. Next up we have the Land Speeders. Certainly not too bad fast attack choices. They have the potential to get melters and flamers where they need to go, but they are trying to fill a fairly crowded battlefield role that they're competing against Invader ATVs and attack bikes. The ATVs have very similar firepower and are far tankier, and the attack bikes have far more firepower and also the core keywords. I think some patterns of Land Speeder could be interesting, particularly say multi-melter and flamer with salamanders perhaps, but again a unit that's often passed up for other choices. I'd say Storm Speeders maybe have the same issue as the Land Speeder, except they're just bigger, around about twice the points, around about twice the firepower, and just under twice the durability. Their firepower's kind of okay, but only having 10 wounds at toughness 6 really doesn't do them any favours for something that could be around 150 points, and being a big unit with a much bigger profile makes them kind of harder to hide, and they're not exactly as much of an expendable threat as the Land Speeders are. I must say I haven't seen very many Storm Speeders on the table since they were released towards the start of 9th. Sticking with the fast attack for a second, and we have the Scout Bike Squad next, maybe taking some of the same problems that Scouts have in 9th, only having a 4+ save and having 1 wound less than their counterpart, the standard Space Marine Bike Squad. I guess they are at least a little bit shootier, as they do get the shotgun and the twin bolt gun, but for the points these guys just seem really quite easy to remove. You're only getting 6 wounds worth of bike for 90 points on the table. I've chosen to put the Tactical Squad down in Tier 3, though to be honest I could have been persuaded to put them up in Tier 2. I really don't think they're all that much far behind the other troops options, but are probably one of the weakest I think. Just for normal bolter dudes, I really don't think that they compare all that well to the Intercessors. They might be 10 points cheaper, but they don't compare all that well to the auto bolt rifle Intercessors, which will get 3 bolter shots up at 24 inches even on the move. Losing access to transhuman physiology as well could also mean that they don't do as well on the durability front. Probably the most interesting loadout for me for tactical squads would be to take 5-man units with a heavy weapon in them. That way they could do a bit of objective camping and still actually threaten to do a little bit of chip damage here and there. Maybe a grav cannon or a las cannon could be a reasonable choice. Kind of an okay choice for holding down an objective. I could happily rank them either in tier 3 or up in tier 2. The Vindicator again I think is one of the stronger Space Marine tank variants right now. Reasonably sturdy for the points cost at toughness 8 with the potential for a 2+ save against ranged attacks with the siege shield, and the damage output for the points isn't too bad, though it is notoriously swingy with the big D6 shot demolisher cannon. Certainly doesn't hurt as a bit of a distraction threat moving up the middle of the table, but with the randomness it's kind of hard to rely on it doing anything too useful, and again might struggle to outcompete sources of firepower that have the core keyword for a bunch of rerolls and synergies. I've put the Repulsor and Repulsor Executioner here too. I would argue they might be perhaps on the lower end of tier 3. They certainly pack a ridiculous amount of guns plastered all over them, but again for the points cost the firepower isn't particularly overwhelming, and for these guys clocking in at over 300 points, toughness 8 and 16 wounds just really isn't enough to stand up to the 9th edition firepower they might face. Any D3+3 damage weapons are going to make absolute mincemeat out of them. It can still be fairly threatening to have a massive threat all in one big go though. Some armies without decent firepower might struggle to deal with them, but in general they aren't a unit I'd take in competitive lists. Next up we have the Whirlwind, kind of an interesting unit as its damage output isn't really all that great, but it does have a really useful stratagem. Ignores line of sight firepower is usually paid for at a premium in 9th, and the Whirlwind is certainly no exception to that, though I'd say perhaps the most useful thing that it does is to use its 1 command point stratagem to make an enemy unit fight last. Space Marines don't have all that many sources of making enemy units fight last in the game, and a Whirlwind could actually be a really good support to a mainly melee army, making sure that one critical enemy unit doesn't get to attack until it's already been hit. For that reason I kind of find the Whirlwind hard to rate. For its actual firepower and damage output I think it's quite underwhelming, but in combination with a melee army I think they could be fairly justifiable, and I could easily be persuaded to rank them up in tier 2 for that role. It is still a fairly hefty price to pay though, at the cost of the tank, and also a stratagem a turn if you want to use that ability. I'd say maybe the Thunderfire Cannon is in a similar position to the Whirlwind, fairly mediocre damage output, and it's kind of the Tremor Shell stratagem that really wants to sell it to you in 9th. Most people seem to think they're not particularly viable at the moment, even with the useful ignores line of sight firepower, ability to slow down a unit, and the potential for a Tech Marine to go around repairing things if the main cannon is destroyed. I'd say they're probably outcompeted by the Whirlwind, and perhaps by a few of the sources of Forge World ignores line of sight firepower too. Next we come to a transport with the sturdy Razorback. Basically if you want a Rhino with a big gun bolted to the top, then this is your choice. Though I'd argue that within Codex Space Marines there aren't really all that many units that really want a transport. A lot of the more efficient units are either Primaris that can't get in here, and shooting units that might be better off served by drop pods, or if you Vanguard veterans have the opportunity to take jump packs. For me, I'm not really the biggest fan of the multi-role vehicle either. I think I'd be more typically drawn to the Rhino and just have it focus on being a chaff transport tank and not have to split its priorities both by using itself to be annoying and get in the way, and also to try and make the best use of the firepower. Next up we come to Reavers, the Primaris Terror and Utility Phobos unit, who again maybe like things like Veteran Intercessors just kind of struggle to compete against other options that can deal more damage. Their Terror Troops aura for -2 leadership is somewhat useful, you might cause a casualty or two with that, and their Shock Grenades and Terror Troop stratagems both can be useful in the right circumstances, but in general I don't think it quite gets them over the line for most armies at the moment, as the Space Marine elites can often just kill the enemy unit right off the board, something that Reavers will usually struggle to do. Assault Marines aren't too bad, their main problem is being outshone by Vanguard veterans really quite hard. An extra 3 points for an extra attack is great on an assault unit, but more importantly the Vanguard veterans' options for discounted power weapons mean they can get some spectacularly cheap lightning claws and good storm shields, just making them an all-round more threatening and dangerous unit. Even if you just wanted relatively cheap assault troops, Vanguard veterans could even take just 2 chainswords and get almost double the amount of attacks as the assault marines just for a couple of extra points. I don't think that assault marines are really dreadful as a unit, but maybe a point or so overcosted, and aren't really likely to see all that much play while Vanguard veterans remain this good. Next we have the Space Marine Stalker, again probably not a very good unit for take-all-comers, but if you are looking for anti-air firepower I think it outshines the Hunter by a fair bit. I'd still say it falls along the lines of a not particularly efficient gun tank, but at least it's far more general purpose than the Hunter is, and it is at least pretty tanky for the cost. The opponent's very unlikely to be wanting to shoot this very cheap toughness 8 tank, if there's other targets available. Space Marine Scouts I have talked about in a recent video on the channel. They moved to the elite slot and became not very happy after that. Their forward deployment ability is really quite good. I'm sure they'd be taken if there weren't other Space Marine units that did it very well, but for only a 30 to 40 point upgrade, I think it's rare that you're not going to want to upgrade to the Infiltrators or Incursors to put some far tougher and more threatening bodies on the table. Their Sniper Scouts are really outshone by the Eliminators too, so currently I'd say again not particularly bad, but just directly outclassed by the other options. The Hammerfall Bunker's a bit of a weird choice, strangely having the potential for basically unlimited damage if there's enough units in range, but on the relatively terrain-dense boards of 9th edition, it's unlikely to be able to live up to its full potential. Fortifications also do have the trouble of not being able to set up too close to other bits of terrain, and if you're playing that strictly in a tournament setting or something, then you might really have trouble placing this guy. I think in normal games of 40k it's going to be kind of underwhelming, possibly just blazing away with a few heavy bolter shots each turn, but potentially could be a really powerful option if you are playing really big games of 40k, where it gets a ridiculous amount of firepower around if there's loads and loads of enemy units on the table and not that much cover. In general though, I can't say it's a unit that I'd ever want to take competitively. Next we have the Firestrike Servo Turret, another non-core firepower unit that somewhat struggles to shine through. Having a 2+ ballistic skill and 2+ save is pretty handy for this guy, but still the points cost for the thing is a bit on the higher side. Its mobility is kind of rubbish, and the 2+ save still might not help you against anti-tank firepower, which has the potential to ruin one turret with one shot. Moving on, and we have the Space Marine Flyers, the Stormhawk Interceptor, Storm Talon Gunship, and Storm Raven. I don't really think that any of them are too bad for their firepower. You do pay a bit of a premium as they're so mobile and can get lines of sight on what they need to, but it just could be a bit exposed to getting shot down first turn if your opponent's got a ton of long-range firepower and gets a few good hits on them. In particular, I do find that the Storm Raven's just a little bit overcosted right now. It just seems like quite a lot of eggs to put in one basket, at only 14 wounds, toughness 7, and no invul save. Finally, for Tier 3, I've ranked the Dreadnoughts that I don't think are quite as strong as the others within the Codex. The standard issue Contemptor Dreadnought from the Codex, the regular pattern Dreadnought, and the Ironclad. I think all of them do the Dreadnought job okay, and it is pretty handy to have the core keyword on them, but they do have their own disadvantages too. The Ironclad's a touch on the slow side for a purely melee beast. The mixed role Contemptor I think just struggles to bring enough threat to the table, both in terms of range and combat, and the regular boxy Dreadnought just feels like the Venerable Dreadnought but worse. For the points cost, the Venerable Dreadnought does work out as a more efficient unit, both in terms of damage dealing and firepower, with a 2+ ballistic skill and 6+ feel no pain. All quite fun and usable choices though, just maybe not quite top tier. Next up we get to Tier 2, all units that I think are decently strong, and certainly usable in tournament lists. They're perhaps not quite as ridiculously efficient as some of the things at the very top of the Space Marine tree. First up we have a couple of characters, Lieutenant and the Judiciary. I do kind of find characters a little bit hard to rank in these tier lists, as they'll often just get taken as the right role for the job, depending on which army you're playing. In general, captains do tend to see a fair bit more play than lieutenants on the whole. If you're looking at one that's going foot slogging, I'd often think that the captain on bike might be a better choice just for more mobility. But if you are looking for just a bit more of a budget option, I think the Indomitus pattern lieutenant with the power sword and the Neo-Volkite pistol is quite efficient, certainly a solid and very usable HQ choice. The Judiciary can bring some fight's last goodness to the table, with his Temper Mortis making one enemy unit strike after all others, but having to buy in a whole character just to access that rule does just seem a little bit on the expensive side. Obviously he's going to have far more value in melee lists, maybe packed into an Impulsor alongside some Blade Guard perhaps, or advancing up the board alongside a character cluster. Depending on positioning though, sometimes his Temper Mortis ability can just be avoided, and I'm sure there'll be a fair few matchups where he might just have been better with a lieutenant or captain. Still though, an interesting choice, and I certainly think that he has his place. Moving on to the Terminators now, and I've ranked Terminators, Assault Terminators and Relic Terminators here. Really quite a nice threatening Space Marine unit. You can either have the dual role of anti-infantry firepower with anti-tank melee from the Relic ones or the regular Terminators, or you can go in for the very tough and threatening Thunderhammer and Storm Shield Terminators, who have the potential to be ridiculously hard to shift for certain enemy units. Having innate deep strike is pretty handy to bring as well, to allow them to be put into reserve for free. I think that these guys can be really usable for certain chapters, in particular Dark Angels with their auto-transhuman physiology thing, or perhaps other chapters building around them as a big synergy unit, maybe things like Black Templars or even White Scars. Currently, I think that people tend to prefer taking Vanguard Veterans over Terminators though, maybe bringing a similar sort of threat to the table, but one that's far more mobile. and if you're going foot slogging, Blade Guard are also hard to pass up as well. Very nice general purpose melee threat, really tough, and can also have transhuman physiology too. Next we come to the sturdy Space Marine Rhino, a very nice cheap transport choice, much as it is for many other factions. For the points cost it's really quite tough and fairly fast, both are things that you want in a transport. I think maybe Space Marines compared with some of the other chapters just don't have quite as many units that you want to put in a Rhino. I think they're particularly good for any armies that have fairly slow and fairly fragile threats that need to be up close, maybe things like Sisters of Battle Repentia or Grey Knight Strike Squads. Overall, I think that Rhinos are a pretty awesome transport, just maybe there's not all that many good units to put in them, and some of the ones that might be good units might often prefer a drop pod. Talking of which, the drop pod is your premium Alpha Strike vehicle. It's really not too uncommon to see one in a list, usually delivering a payload of Devastators into the fray to get some nice cheap shooting down range. Delivering that Alpha Strike does cost a fair bit, but it often is worth it to the army as a whole, allowing you to delete one of the main enemy threats. Once on the table, the drop pod is kind of a bit useless. Hopefully if you can snag it onto an objective, it can give you one more thing your opponent has to shoot off it. But I think it often can be worth it delivering Devastators into the fray, or maybe things like Stern Guard Veterans for Salamanders. For the Devastators themselves, if they are being loaded up in drop pods, which will be my favourite way to field them, I'd usually be looking either at multi-motors for anti-tank, or grav cannons for general purpose firepower, particularly good against Space Marines and elite infantry. I think they are one of the units that are better in certain chapters than others. In particular, Iron Hands Devastators coming out of drop pods are really nice indeed. Their first turn combat doctrine allowing you to ignore the penalty for moving and shooting, and also reroll ones to hit with those heavy weapons to boot. I think they're fairly efficient for virtually any chapter though, particularly any other ones that have other ways of ignoring the shooting penalty, such as Space Wolves with their Long Fangs stratagem. Often getting the efficient firepower right into the enemy unit that least wants to take it could well be worth the hefty points price. Next up we come to the Impulsor, the Primaris hover transport that can be used to slingshot units onto objectives. Very fast and useful, but does come at a bit of a premium points cost for that. They're perhaps most commonly seen taking shield domes and driving things like Blade Guard or Assault Intercessors up the board where they can better get their hands on the enemy. I feel like the Impulsor is a really nice transport option, though it's perhaps just a little bit points intensive to be spammed all the time. Maybe a bit more likely to be seen delivering a expensive squad with a character as opposed to having an entire battle line of them. The Landspeeder Storm seems to have found a good role being a very fast-moving, objective-securing unit. Never mind any nonsense about its actual intended role transporting Space Marine scouts. For 55 points to put 7 wounds on the table really isn't all that bad. It's got a massive 18-inch movement for getting to objectives or moving into table quarters and things. Packs a little bit of anti-infantry firepower, and can even give a -1 to hit debuff on one important enemy unit. There's really quite a lot of utility for a very cheap model, though it really doesn't seem all that overwhelming for transporting scouts to be honest, as the main value of scouts in my mind is their forward deployability, and you're kind of sacrificing that if you're loading them up in this. Moving back to the troop section, and we have the Assault Intercessors here. They seem to be taking a little bit less than their standard Intercessor counterparts, but aren't such a bad choice for the various Assault chapters out there, things like Blood Angels, White Scars, Space Wolves or Black Templars. Their damage output's okay, and having the ability to fight again is useful, and it's quite nice to have cheap Primaris bodies that you can throw towards objectives. In general though, I think that more people tend to use Intercessors than these guys, because the Intercessors have some half-decent range threat, as well as being somewhat capable of bullying light infantry in combat. In general, that seems to be the better combo for holding down home field objectives, though depending on what you're using them for, I think that Assault Intercessors are a perfectly viable alternative. Staying with the troops, we have Heavy Intercessors next. Basically like your standard issue troops, but bigger, tougher and beefier. Usually for the points cost it's going to take more effort to take these down compared with standard Intercessors. Having long range and strength 5 guns is pretty helpful as well, though for the points they usually won't do quite as much damage as the standard variety. In general, I think that the numbers of the Heavy Intercessors really are quite good, but they maybe just don't see quite as much play as some of the other troops, just because you have to commit so many more points to a minimum size squad. If you can get a job done with a standard Intercessor squad for 100 points, you don't really need to spend 140 points doing it extra well. And I think that's maybe the reason that you don't see these quite as much as standard Intercessors in competitive lists, despite them being really quite a good unit. Next we have the Aggressors, a bit on the slow side, but a fair amount of anti-infantry firepower and some nice generalist melee with those power fists. I think after they lost their double shoot rule, these guys just aren't quite as overwhelming as they used to be. I think a reasonable enough general purpose unit, but perhaps similar to the Assault Centurions, they might just have a little bit of trouble with delivery. Again, I feel like they might be a bit stronger in certain chapters, things like Raven Guard where they might be able to start up the board with that Warlord trait, or perhaps Salamanders where their Twin Flamers can be really very scary for the points cost indeed. I think with a core unit with plenty of damage output and at least being reasonably tough, they'll usually be okay in a Space Marine battle line, but just often get passed over for other units that are more easily usable. Next we have the Venerable Dreadnought, similar to the standard pattern one, but he hits on 2s and has a 6+ feel no pain. Generally the numbers just work him out as a more efficient unit than the standard Dreadnought, and I'd be most tempted to use him as an anti-tank role. 2 twin las cannon shots and a missile launcher all hitting on 2s with rerolls for the core keywords. It's really quite an efficient choice of long-ranged anti-tank. I'd say the main reason that he doesn't see as much play is because the Redemptor Dreadnought just seems to do his role a bit better. Similar firepower, but some melee as well. Next we have the Outriders and the Bike Squad, both fairly fast and sturdy units and are fairly decent at anti-infantry duties. For the points the bikes are a bit shootier and the Outriders are a little bit choppier. I'd maybe argue that actually the standard Bike Squad is probably a little bit better for the points, but people quite like using the new Outriders because they come in the starter sets and in Indomitus. I think both of them are units that are quite good just for nipping onto objectives and skirmishing with a few enemy infantry that aren't really expected to do all that much heavy lifting. I wouldn't generally be wanting to spam these, but a couple of units can add a fair bit to a Space Marine list, particularly in some chapters like White Scars where they can have a crazy long charge and threat range, or Dark Angels where they get the 5+ invul and Raven Wing shenanigans. Sticking with the fast attack, we also have the Invader ATV here. I did a video on him quite recently if you want to search it up. Basically the numbers seem to shake out as being a fair bit more durable than the attack bike, and transhuman physiology help with that, though its damage output is a bit less, and of course it lacks the core keyword, which means you aren't getting any rerolls from characters. Generally though, I still think they're pretty usable, fast enough to get onto objectives, a little bit of firepower, and a bit of a nuisance to try and shoot off once they're there. Suppressors seem to be a unit that are creeping into Space Marine lists a little bit more these days. A few tournament lists do seem to be finding a role for them. They are fairly fast for jumping around doing actions, and their autocannons are quite useful against the current meta, being pretty much one of the ideal choices to gun down Drukhari raiders. Their main weaknesses are that they aren't all that tough for the points cost, and they do suffer a fair bit of accuracy penalty on the move, but a unit or two isn't too bad for the utility that they bring, plus also being able to deny overwatch on a key unit could potentially be very handy. Moving on to the Gravis jump packs, and we come to the Inceptor squad. Plasma Inceptors were one of the best units in the Space Marine Codex when they came out, but they've suffered 2 different points increases since, and now I'd say both the Bolters and the Plasmas are fairly even in terms of usability, depending on whether you want a tanky and less threatening squad, or a squad that will pretty much put decent firepower on anything, but you do have to pay a big premium for. I think they're quite nice as a troubleshooter unit. I've been quite enjoying a squad of Bolter Inceptors myself, jumping around in the backfield, deleting enemy units that try and break through, and putting some nice general purpose firepower to whittle down threats before they get charged. I've certainly seen people use the Plasma Inceptors though, either in White Scars or Dark Angels. White Scars are quite nice for being able to advance and shoot for some enormously threatening on the board action, and Dark Angels for weapons of the Dark Age, and some enormous damage 3 Plasma Punch. Overall I think that both types are still good, but just no longer at the near auto-include territory that those Plasma Inceptors used to be when they first came out. Finally, for the Tier 2 units, we have the Invicta Tactical Warsuit, really quite a threatening unit with the sheer amount of shots the thing puts out, backed up by a pretty hefty combat punch, and potentially can be incredibly threatening on turn 1 as it gets to forward deploy. I'd say these things do give you some really interesting tactical options in-game. You can either think about deploying them up front for an attempted alpha strike, or if it makes sense to use them more of a gun turret in a game, you can do that just as well. They're perhaps best in Ultramarines where you can have the best of both worlds, and use a stratagem to redeploy them as you see fit. Finally, we're getting into the very top of the Space Marine army list, and here's basically the list of units that I'd most expect to see competitive Space Marine lists build around, all of which are very efficient for the battlefield role that they fill. Starting out, we have perhaps one of my favourite Space Marine units in the Vanguard Veterans. These guys just do melee damage output and durability really quite well, an incredibly flexible unit. A lot of people tend to run the Storm Shield and Lightning Claw combo that makes them an annoying unit to take out, and particularly with the addition of the Assault Doctrine will generally make them a threat that can take out virtually any target. They're just all around efficient, have good movement, good durability and good melee. Even in less combat focused chapters, they can be perfectly well worth including just on their raw efficiency alone. Next, let's just briefly touch on some of the characters that I think are most efficient for commanding the army. Captains give you some cheap and effective rerolls, are the fightiest character for tooling up with combat relics, and are relatively durable as well with their iron halos. I'm a particular fan of the bike captain, who I think is really efficient for his points, great maneuverability, a bit of firepower and melee threat too, or maybe the captain from Indomitus with the storm shield. Rarely a bad choice to lead an army, they can help out both range and combat units with their rerolls. Librarians are again one of the most commonly taken competitive characters. They've got plenty of powerful options just from the core Codex. Psychic Fortress for a 5+ invul save, which is nice with 3+ save infantry or Redemptor dreadnoughts, but having a unique discipline for every single chapter means they can often be a great choice for any specific supplement. I did an entire video on librarians recently, breaking down some of their best spells. In armies like Space Wolves, White Scars, Dark Angels and Deathwatch though, they can really shine. Next up we have Chaplains, in particular the Primaris Chaplain on the bike, which I think is probably the best of the bunch. Take the Master of Sanctity and the Wise Orator trait, and you have 2 litanies that go off on a 2+, giving you some really powerful melee rerolls for your combat units, and potentially boosts at range or boosts to charge as well. Having that on an enormously mobile platform that can also be functional as a melee beatstick as well, and you're generally in for a good time. Dreadnought gun castles are perhaps one of the strongest ways to play Space Marines right now, with Redemptors or Relic Contemptor dreadnoughts, and a Tech Marine is a great HQ choice to include in one of those. Quite a cheap character, packs at least some threat in melee, repairs vehicles, makes one shoot a bit better, and if you take the Primaris Tech Marine, they can even lay down some pretty efficient firepower with that Forge Bolter. If you're taking vehicles in virtually any numbers whatsoever, a Tech Marine is a very easily viable HQ. Finally, for buffing characters, the Apothecary I think is still worth a good mention competitively, and in particular the Chief Apothecary with the Selfless Healer Warlord trait. If you're making any sort of Space Marine list that's revolving around a castle of 3 wound infantry, things like Blade Guard veterans, Eradicators, or even things like attack bikes, this guy can heal them when they're injured, give them a 6+ feel no pain, and restore a slain model to the squad every turn. He'll often very easily pay for himself over the course of the game, and bonus points if you happen to play Blood Angels or Dark Angels, who can get a faster moving Sanguinary Priest with a jump pack, or a Ravenwing Apothecary on bike. Next up we have the Intercessors, who when I looked at Primaris troops in tournament lists recently, they still seem to be taken the most commonly. A very nice sturdy battle line unit, 20 points per model, decently tough, with a decent amount of the range threat, and can even mix it up in combat a bit if the enemy gets too close. They're fairly efficient at bullying light infantry. Certainly arguably one of the best choices for defending home field objectives, and their rapid fire stratagem can sometimes be really useful in a pinch if you just need to eke out a tiny little bit of extra firepower to do something key. Otherwise, I think that the other top tier troops choices are the Infiltrators and Incursors, basically getting a similar sort of stat line to an Intercessor, but trading out a little bit of firepower for the forward deployment rule to set up the board. It allows them to jump on midfield objectives nice and early, maybe even threaten charges on the first turn against enemy units, and if you shell out for the slightly pricier Infiltrators, you can make it very hard for enemy deep strikers to set up, as they have to set up greater than 12 inches away. I'd normally only take 1 or 2 of these units in a list, but in most normal looking Space Marine armies I'd say they're very near auto-include territory. Having tough units in the midfield right from turn 1 is generally going to be a big help on winning out the objective game and potentially screening out enemy units. Next up we come to the Blade Guard veterans, the Primaris combat unit with their storm shields and mastercrafted power swords, who despite being quite slow are still a very viable melee infantry choice, mainly because they're tanky enough to slog their way up the board, and then they do hit like a truck against virtually anything they get in combat with when they get to grips with the enemy. You can have big blocks of 5 of them moving up with character support, but even just a unit or 2 of 3-man troops heading towards the midfield objectives can give the opponent an annoying threat to deal with, and one that can be at least somewhat hard to gun down at range, particularly with access to transhuman physiology. They particularly like being White Scars as well, as that really helps them with their mobility issues, allowing them to advance and charge. Eradicators have been nerfed since I made the last Space Marine tier list. They went up to 45 points a model from 40, but are still a spectacularly efficient source of anti-tank firepower. I'd usually field them in 3-man units myself, a really powerful anti-tank threat that you can just have lurk in your deployment zone, or maybe put them into strategic reserve for a command point and have them pop up on the enemy flanks within melter range and threaten to just obliterate an enemy vehicle. I think they fill the dedicated anti-tank niche spectacularly well. They're probably a unit that you don't want to go too overboard on, as they're not that good if your opponent doesn't have all that many hard targets. To rival the Eradicators, the other main choice is the multi-melter attack bike for your dedicated anti-tank firepower, and I think they have some decent pros and cons over the Gravis armoured boys. They don't pack as much anti-tank firepower for the points, and they're not quite as tough for the points either, but they give you a lot more options as to what you can actually shoot due to their great movement, and they have a little bit of anti-infantry firepower to plink away at enemy squads while the multi-melter does its thing. I think both of them are very usable personally, though maybe attack bikes have the edge in certain armies like Dark Angels, where they get some powerful buffs included for free. Next up we have the Primaris Snipers in the Eliminators. These guys were kind of okay from the base codex, but in my opinion have become a really solid choice since they got their massive points drop, and now cost only 25 points per model. It's made them some of the most efficient snipers in the entire game, with their damage 2 sniper rifles hitting on 2s. They're potentially quite a lot sturdier and hard to remove than some of the Primaris troops when they're in cover. Those camo cloaks can have them on an effective 1+ save against ranged attacks, and their forward deployment means that they can always flex into being a screening and area denial unit, which I think they can afford to do at only 75 points. If in the given matchup they're going to have more value just dying on the front lines, as opposed to sitting back and trying to plink off enemy characters. A really nice flexible utility unit. I think a squad or two is rarely going to be a wrong choice. Talking of utility units, we come to Servitors, perhaps slightly unexpected heroes of the Space Marine objectives and actions game. Servitors aren't expected to do any real damage to the opponent, or even be all that durable, but there's a lot of value in just having a really cheap unit all of its own, as they can often function just as well as a Space Marine squad at doing certain tasks, while freeing up your actual Space Marines to go forward and kill the enemy. If you've got a well-hidden objective, a Servitor squad might be able to take it just as well as Intercessors, for only a tiny fraction of the cost. They can do actions like retrieve Octarius data without having to commit your full Space Marine units to doing that, and if you need to screen out some enemy either from deep strike or getting in melee, then Servitors are the best units to have dying on the front lines, as opposed to sacrificing some actual Space Marines. Again, if you have a few points spare, getting a unit or two of Servitors on the board really isn't the worst thing for scoring you a few more victory points towards winning the mission. Next we have Company Veterans, a cheap 2-man elite squad which can be quite good for gamey shenanigans with the bodyguard special rule, and again perhaps filling a similar role to the Servitors, being a cheap rubbishy unit that can be used to do actions or hold down objectives out of line of sight. If your list has a few really important but fragile characters, having a couple of these guys along to tank some sniper bullets could be nice, and unlike Servitors, these guys are fully fledged Space Marines. They will hold their own in a fight, though obviously in small numbers they won't be expected to do too much just by themselves. Finally, it seems that we're rounding up the tier list with some of the strongest Space Marine firepower around. Redemptor Dreadnoughts seem to be the go-to thing for gunning down the enemy these days. Give them a Macroplasma Incinerator, Icarus Pod and Onslaught Gatling Cannon, and for 185 points you have a simply excellent gun turret. They're really quite tough with 13 wounds plus Duty Eternal, can get rerolls from characters with a core keyword and use Wisdom of the Ancients for even more rerolls, have fairly decent movement, very generalist firepower that can take out both vehicles and infantry, and as if that weren't enough, if the enemy does get too close, they can try and smash them up in combat with a massive damage D3+3 combat weapon. They're just really efficient, and it makes it hard to take quite a lot of the other Space Marine vehicle choices, just because for so many options you can say, why would you take that when you could just take a Redemptor Dreadnought which can shoot just as well and also fight in melee. Definitely a unit that you can justify spamming if you want to. Finally, in general I decided I'd leave Forge World units out of this list, but I thought that we couldn't make a Space Marine tier list without at least mentioning the spectacular firepower of the Relic Contemptor Dreadnought with the Volkite Culverins. It's 150 points and costs 1 command point because of Martial Legacy, but alongside the Redemptor Dreadnought, these guys just put out spectacular generalist firepower, with 16 long-range damage 2 shots, admittedly with no AP, but chased down with a few mortal wounds on their 6s to wound. They're fairly tough for the points, with their Invul Save and Duty Eternal, at least reasonably fast moving, a core for the rerolls, and really like the Devastator Doctrine for the extra AP-1 for the Turn 1 Alpha Strike. Some chapters can get loads more out of them as well, particularly armies like Deathwatch giving them full rerolls against a datasheet with one of their relics for a turn, and they're pretty solid against some of the meta armies at the moment. They're a pretty much ideal choice against Dark Eldar, wounding most of their infantry on 2s and their raiders on a 4+. Overall, definitely an undercosted unit, and it's quite funny to see just how many armies gravitate towards this one very niche Forge World choice. I'd be kind of surprised if this doesn't get a points nerf in the next chapter approved. So I think that just about brings us to the end of our tier list of Space Marine units in 9th edition. Let me know what you think down in the comments below as always. If I've missed anything or rated anything too high or too low, be sure to let me know about it in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k content coming, including plenty more for the Space Marines. Finally, if you'd like to help support the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page. Making daily videos does take an enormous amount of time, particularly when they're 40-minute epics like this one. They really do take a fair amount of time and effort. If you are enjoying the videos quite regularly, any support on the Patreon page is enormously appreciated. It is how I keep the channel going and the videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early each week, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.